Throughout modern history, humanity has made remarkable strides towards unraveling the secrets of the universe. Yet, in spite of these impressive scientific achievements, certain fundamental mysteries continue to evade both our powers of reason and our modern physics. Among these are: is there a divine order within the cosmos? What are the causes behind the bizarre events known as paranormal? Are anti-gravity, time travel, and teleportation possible, or are they just food for the fantasy? How was matter created from the void? Is there a gateway to a higher dimension, and what does it look like? Is dark matter real, and why can't we see it? How did life originate on Earth? Could UFOs really be advanced spacecraft from another world? And how does religion and spirituality fit into all of this? Questions like these have long confounded scientists, philosophers, and many alike. Efforts to solve these riddles have often suffered from too narrow of a focus, such as those that attempt to describe telepathy or consciousness in terms of quantum theory while overlooking the vast body of other unexplained phenomena. None have led us to a single cosmological framework that can accommodate for a wealth of scientific anomalies, spiritual experiences, and paranormal events that are often observed and recorded. Now, for the first time, Behind the Cosmic Veil cracks the cosmic code of creation with a bold new theory of everything that encompasses all these mysteries and many more. And the groundbreaking work author Thomas P. Fusco employs a revolutionary approach to uncover the underlying cosmic matrix, connecting contemporary physics, the human psyche, paranormal phenomenon, and a long-established religious principle, then weaves it into an entirely new model of reality never before described. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are joined by the author of the book Behind the Cosmic Veil, Mr. Thomas P. Fusco. This is the theory of everything. This is Albert Einstein's theory, but figured out. And it's a lot more than Einstein ever envisioned. A lot more. Isn't that right, Thomas?
It's more than Einstein ever had to consider in his time.
Now, let's talk, before we get to the book, how did you become interested in the theory of everything? How did you go from, your everyday life to saying, you know what, I got to figure this out?
Well, I was always a very pragmatic and scientifically minded individual. For me, everything had to have an answer. As a kid, I was one of those that always needed to know why and how everything worked. And in my teenage years and early 20s, I had a few very unusual experiences that were kind of supernatural. And so for me, it caused me to call into question the physical model that I had been taught in the sciences about the way the universe was put together. Clearly, those models just didn't incorporate anything like this or offer any kind of explanation for it at all. So for me, the compelling question became, how is the universe put together that can allow these kinds of things that people call supernatural or paranormal to occur? And so I spent several decades doing the research on that, and the results of all that is in Behind the Cosmic Veil.
Now, let's talk about what exactly we're talking about when we say paranormal, supernatural. It's more than just ghosts. It's more than just aliens. There's a lot more to the paranormal spectrum, is there?
Yeah, absolutely. And this was one of the early issues that I had to confront, that these terms were very loose. They were used for kind of a catch-all basket for anything that was weird or strange or unexplained, to throw them in a paranormal category.
Right.
So for me, I felt it was very important to come up with a scientifically reasonable definition of what this means. And so for me, it boiled down to anything that is a physical observation. It's observable, so it has to be physical.
Right.
That actually interacts. It can interact with its environment. It's a physical effect, but no direct connected physical cause local to that event. physics has a word for this. They call it non-locality or non-local causality. It's effect without a locally connected physical cause, what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. And so just to give you one example, for people who are not accustomed to this particular term, you and I are talking, Angel. We're speaking in normal voices. The air is being vibrated according to a frequency and amplitude that when it vibrates our eardrums, our brain interprets it as a voice or a sound. But let's say like in a haunted house where they hear these disembodied voices, where the air molecules are still vibrating, all of that, the effect is normal. The vibrations are at a frequency and amplitude, hits our ears, we interpret it as a voice, but there's no set of physical vocal cords directly locally connected to the air that's vibrating. There's no local cause there. There's only the effect.
Right.
And so for me, that's what constitutes a scientific definition of the paranormal. What is paranormal?
Well, then what is paranormal is the question, really.
Well, anything that fits that criteria. So when we start looking at it that way, and it's a very good scientific definition. It's not anything that outside the realm of normal scientific thinking. But what it does is that it allows us to look at a lot of different types of effects, and we find that some of them are in this category. There's a number of different effects that we see in quantum physics, for example. Quantum physics is talked about a lot today in relation to the supernatural and the paranormal, where we see these effects with no direct physical cause. We're seeing things happen basically for no reason at all. So in my model, it's kind of backwards in a way from conventional thinking. Rather than trying to define the paranormal in terms of quantum physics, according to my model, quantum physics is paranormal. It's kind of the opposite. And then when we start looking at these things, we can, bring in elements of parapsychology, psychic phenomena, which would fall under the same category. And one of the elements which is at the heart of my work is that it actually defines gravity as a paranormal effect.
That's interesting. How is that so? Because, we really, as scientists, would admit to, we don't very little of what gravity really is. Even though we have a lot of theories, there's no concrete proof of what gravity really is or what the effect is. So how would you describe it?
Well, Angel, you're right on with that, because most people have gone through school and they thought that they were taught all about gravity.
Right.
But what they were actually taught about was about gravitational effect.
Right, the effect itself.
Yes, and we know quite a bit about gravitational effect. We know enough about it to, shoot a piece of hardware to the outer reaches of the solar system and figure out more or less where it's going to wind up. Tracking its paths through all the different gravitational fields. But when it comes down to what the substance of gravity is, what it really is, we really don't know.
Right.
It's traditionally been thought of as a force. You know that started in the 1800s with Faraday and, I forget the other fellow off the top of my head, very famous physicist, who felt that gravity worked a lot like electromagnetism, was some sort of an attractive force. So they classified it. They just assumed that it was a force. But forces are,
strong with us.
Yeah, they're conveyed as particles to propagate as waves.
Okay.
So in order for gravity to actually be a quote-unquote classical force, we would have to be able to isolate a particle of gravity, which would be the graviton, and a gravity wave. Out of decades of research, we have never been able to identify or isolate a graviton.
Right. That's true.
Yeah, and there's a lot of other weird things about gravity, as you know. Yep. When Einstein was trying to mathematically demonstrate his unified field theory, he failed in the area of gravity. He couldn't express it mathematically through the 3 dimensions of space and the 1 dimension of time, the 4-dimensional space-time framework that he'd come up with. And, of course, we have another system that looks at the subatomic world called quantum physics or quantum mechanics. And we've never been able to reconcile relativity, Einstein's relativity, with quantum mechanics because of gravity. We stumble on that. Most lay people aren't aware that the standard model that physicists use, and when I say standard model, I mean capital S, capital M. The standard model that they use to describe the universe, which includes the particles and all their interactions, that model has no expression for gravity.
True, yeah.
It's just not there. We can't formulate one. And now, of course, in recent decades, our observations, our powers of observation with our advanced instrumentation is so much more than what Einstein had available to him that we're discovering there's close to 90% of the gravitational bending, because gravity is always associated with the bending of space.
Right.
There's about 90% more gravitational lensing in the visible universe than there is mass to generate it. We see these vast fields of gravitational lensing with no adjacent physical, locally connected mass as a gravitational generating cause. Boy, that sounds like that paranormal definition, doesn't it?
Doesn't it? Thomas, would Einstein if Einstein was alive today, do you think he would have made that leap and made the connection with the paranormal?
I don't know. I know Einstein, he had been asked a question once about UFOs, and he basically acted like he didn't want to know anything about them at all.
That's interesting, actually.
Yeah, he didn't want to address that issue in any way, shape, or form or get involved with it. So I'm not sure. I think Einstein, in studying his writings, when it got into areas that were, outside of real mathematically confirmed physics, Einstein kind of hedged himself a little bit. And he never really showed his hand, although sometimes he would give little glimpses, into certain ways that he saw things. And then other times he would take a hard party line where he didn't even recognize some of these things that he would allude to at other times. So it's pretty hard to peg Einstein on those kinds of things. But I think that he would come to the understanding that I think he would agree that we are literally running out of material to explain everything we observe. We have run out of material. And so this is why physicists in recent decades have been making up these imaginary substances. So we see all this gravity with no adjacent mass. Well, the universe has to have a material explanation, so we just have to make up material. We have to invent it. And so this is what dark matter is. It's an invented subject or substance. There's no proof that it exists. There's only proof that we need something to explain why we have all this gravity with no mass.
Right, to fill the void.
Yeah, we have certain other problems in particle physics where we needed to make up these balancing particles that are called supersymmetrical particles or supersymmetry. And this is something else that this was going to be a sure bet that the Large Hadron Collider over in Europe, CERN's collider, was going to easily find supersymmetrical particles, and they haven't found a single one.
There were so many people afraid that thing was going to create a black hole. Do you think that's relatively possible with the Hadron Collider?
Yeah, I remember reading about that, and I'm not sure what to think of it. It doesn't look like it did,
Right.
If it does, it must be on such a minuscule scale, and then passes out of existence so quickly that it's not an issue. But
Still a scary thought, but we really don't even know what black holes are. I mean, we can sort of detect them, can we? But there is no real solid proof that even black holes exist, right?
Well, Angel, you're absolutely right. I mean, and obviously you've read into some of this stuff.
Oh, yeah, I have no idea.
You know, there's about 5 or 6 competing theories right now,
right,
as to what actually is these structures that we observe that we call black holes. The Stephen Hawking model is the one that people most identify with. It's the classical definition of a black hole. But there are competing theories to that. Not everybody in physics just lays down for Hawking's interpretation of what a black hole is. Every one of these models answers certain questions, but at the same time creates other problems that are unresolvable. They break other laws. And so we really haven't nailed down what a black hole is, too. You're absolutely right.
It's funny how little we actually know about space. But you know, I read a report not long ago that we know less about our own oceans than we know about space itself. We're still at a very, very early stage in our evolution, aren't we, Thomas?
Scientifically speaking, I mean, if you consider that, you know, based on Western civilization or Western history, the way we view it, you know, we're pushing back the frontiers of the existence of man back to 1.5 million years. We know that Cro-Magnon man, which is pretty much more or less like we are, we're talking about 50,000 years ago, where they were prevalent. And yet, here we have our civilization, Western civilization, really began to become established only about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago.
Right.
And we went, in those short periods of time, from a caveman to a spaceman.
That's
you know,
very true.
That's very odd, you know.
Yeah.
That's very strange.
No, it's an exciting time to be alive, to be able to see, you know, the first man walk on the moon, to see all the advanced technologies we have now, computers and iPads and all the kind of crazy things. We're witnessing the birth of all this amazing technology, but can you imagine being born about 100 years from now? The kind of technology is going to be around.
Oh my, it's unimaginable, I think. But I think one of the reasons, and this is just my own personal view, I think one of the reasons that it's unimaginable is because if we continue on our technological development line, but we also continue on our ability as a race to not be able to handle these things very well, we reach a point where there clearly has to be some sort of a pivot point, some sort of a climax, to where we actually learn as a species to control what it is that we invent, or we'll be destroyed by it.
And the sad thing is, it looks like we're going to be destroyed by a lot of other things before we were destroyed by anything like that, with wars and all kinds of stuff that's going on the planet. Thomas, let me ask you, let's get back to gravity for a second here.
Sure.
You know, because I don't want to leave that, you know, unfinished. You know, we kind of sidetracked a little bit. But, you know, getting back to gravity and the effects that we can observe with gravity, does gravity, do you think, work differently on certain parts of the universe? For example, you know, as the closer you get to the sun, will gravity work completely different to the point that maybe time travel would be possible? Because you know, a lot of theories are that we need the power of a sun, and the reason I bring this up because there was a story recently of a large UFO near the sun. I don't know if you've read about this.
Yeah, I did hear about that.
I mean, a massive UFO near the sun. How is that even possible? Something that large, you know, near our sun. But do you think that maybe there is some possibility that time travel could be possible using gravity and using a force as strong as the sun?
Yes, in a sense. And my model actually gives a, you know, mechanical definition of how time travel might be accomplished. And does it have something to do with gravity? Yes, but not in a way that people would normally think. My model is very different. We were talking a little bit about it before the show. essentially, what I do is this. I accept the observations that we have so far, particularly those that we've not been able to find material explanations for, like gravity, without a graviton. I just look at that and say, well, what if it is exactly what it looks like? What if we have an effect, and there really isn't any material substance to it, like a graviton or a gravity wave? What if we just accept what's in front of our eyes? What if we accept the fact that there is 90% more of this bending of space in the universe than there is adjacent mass that, according to the conventional materialistic view, is supposed to bend this space? What if we look at it not rather than mass bends space that generates gravity, but we have gravity and bending of space with no mass? What if the gravity is the cause and not the effect? What if instead of having a sphere of bent space around a planet, so to speak, or the sun, that the sun is supposedly bending this space, what if these bends of space are like these big bubbles in which matter materializes? What if they actually are like wombs or crucibles in which material reality takes form and shape? This would explain a lot of things, Angel. First of all, everything that we know about gravitational effect would be exactly the same. Nothing would change. We would still weigh the same. We would still be able to shoot spaceships out into orbit and on the moon. Everything would behave exactly the way it is, the way it does to us now. But by saying this, that the bending of space is actually a cause and not an effect, it would eliminate our need for these material explanations that we can't find, this dark matter and a graviton and the Higgs field and supersymmetry. It would eliminate our need for any of those things. And it would also let us know that there was something outside of our physical universe that was part of reality, but a part that we rarely perceive.
Well, let me ask you, does this include parallel universes?
That's a different subject altogether. I actually don't believe in the multiverse.
Okay.
And I have some very convincing arguments against it. It's kind of a separate school of thought, so to speak. It's a separate vein of conversation. But what I say is this, is that every scientific theory, which actually is scientific speculation or hypothesis, the multiverse is not a true scientific theory because it makes no predictions that are testable. That's what separates this theory from a scientific theory. Einstein had a theory that space was bent around the sun, around the curvature, around these all objects. What made his a scientific theory is that he predicted that light waves traveling around the sun in its vicinity would be displaced by 1.75 degrees. And then it turned out to be true when we tested that prediction. That's what makes a scientific theory different than a theory, speculation, philosophy, metaphysics, all of those things. The multiverse makes no scientific predictions. It is completely untestable. But with all these speculations, the multiverse is based upon the idea of quantum probability, that in a quantum state there's a given number of possible outcomes, and that when that outcome is realized, it turns into a specific event. But what the idea with multiverse is that every possibility materializes. Every possibility realizes in its own separate universe. That would mean that every universe is essentially different than ours. So,
now,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, continue. But I do have a question from the chat room, and I don't want to sidetrack too much. I want to get this question in. Brad wants to know, if there is no multiverse, then will time be linear?
Well, in four-dimensional space, time is linear, absolutely. But here's the thing, and this is where we get confused, and this is where my theory has actually made a breakthrough conceptually, that it makes a conceptual separation between what is physical and what is superphysical. Because, like, give you an example, a lot of people talk about spirit energy in the paranormal and metaphysics. Well, energy is physical and spiritual isn't. Spirit is not physical.
Right.
So saying spirit energy is like an oxymoron. It's like saying honest politician.
Or good lawyer.
But when we start
Yes.
giving everything physical attributes, that's where we get messed up, and that's what's caused us to be in an intellectual stalemate for quite a long time. So within the confines of space-time, time is definitely linear. It moves from the past to the future.
That's an interesting theory. You know, I've always been a fan of Michio Kaku's work when it comes to space-time and parallel universes, and you know, the theory of parallel universes. It's fascinating to me. You know, shows like Fringe and Sliders, you know, that deal with these shows always really, you know, interested me growing up, and still to today. But it's interesting to hear somebody say that they really don't think that there is such a thing as a parallel universe. That's interesting to me.
I can explain what I'm talking about.
No, I completely I understand what you're talking about. That's interesting to me because that completely throws, you know, a lot of what reality could be into a completely different mix. And when you really think about it, that completely changes the spectrum of a lot of the stuff that I've always, you know, been interested in. I guess I could say. That's pretty damn interesting. So, how would you equate then for example, the other dimensions, because a lot of people consider like dimensional travel to be kind of parallel universe travel. That'd be, you know, interdimensional. But if there is no interdimensional travel like that, no parallel universes, so you're talking about different dimensions, then more like Einstein would say, where space and time is the fourth dimension, and then there's higher dimensions above that. Correct?
Well, actually, you know, Einstein pretty much confined himself to four-dimensional space-time.
Right.
Yeah, and so here's one of the different paradigms, and I think you have to start at a starting point,
right,
before you can begin to see things clearly. There's all kinds of information. If you could imagine, Angel, the Great Pyramid of Egypt, and imagine that, number one, we have no idea of a shape of a pyramid, that this is the only pyramid structure in the world. I'm giving a hypothetical. And second of all, let's assume that when we discovered it, we found that it was completely disassembled. It was a big pile of rocks all over the place. How would we begin to put it together? Well, the way that we would put it together, the easiest way, is to find the capstone. If we found that one capstone, every other stone would fall underneath of it, and it would be clear as a bell. A child could figure it out. But if we started with any other stone, we would not be able to see how this would manifest in the complete structure. And figuring these kinds of things out are like that. We need to start at the capstone to come up with a singular concept which can grow and spread out to everything that we observe. And that capstone, one of those, the fundamental of that capstone for me, is that the entire universe is an expression of materialized information. Now,
would that go along with the holographic universe theory?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you're talking about David Bohm now.
Yes.
Oh, my, yeah, one of the most profound and prominent physicists of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he talked about this information arising from what he called implicate order, that this was an order, a structure that lay outside of the physical universe, but established and defined and determined what was in the physical universe. And so we're talking about materialized, which is space-time, matter, and energy, material, materialized information. If we were going to talk about it in a spiritual point of view, If you could imagine a person's soul as the information that comprises what they would be constructed from, and imagine the physical human being in this realm as that information fully materialized. When you begin to look at reality this way, like I say in the title of my book, Behind the Cosmic Veil, the veil begins to be set aside, and you can begin to see deeper into the very fundamental nature of reality.
It kind of makes us almost seem like we're avatars.
In a sense, like the movie you're talking about, right?
Yeah, kind of like the movie. Yeah, we are avatars in a sense. The human being the soul, and the big robot, whatever, being the avatar.
Yeah, there are parallels to that. Yeah, I get what you're saying, the gist of what you're saying, and yes, that would be a good mental image from which to reason. Absolutely.
Now, wouldn't it be really funny, Thomas, if we find out once we die that this whole reality that we've lived, this life we live, is nothing more than a video game that we play from the other realm?
Oh, I've heard that before. Oh, my. I have certain issues with that as well. The way, a lot of these speculations, Angel, have come from, and this is what I assert, they come from trying to reckon with all of these observations and all of these experiences without standing at the capstone.
Right.
When you stand at that capstone, you find that there are ways to explain the universe in a much easier and a consistent point of view, where you don't need to go into some of these other speculations because everything's answered by the given approach, by the singular approach. So if we have this realm outside of space-time, what I call superphysical, superdimensional, or I give it a very specific name in my book, supergeometry, which is a structure, an order, a collection of information that exists above the physical universe. And we imagine that this information can somehow materialize into the physical universe. It makes more sense than something like we're in a Matrix-like game where there's infinite numbers of alternate universes, which is, when you stop and think about it, that is also an attempt to explain what we observe materially.
Right.
Since we run out of material to explain what we see in our universe, let's just make up another universe and borrow some material from that one. Boom, problem solved. But this model that I have in my book has been causing a lot of stir, and it's been getting a lot of attention because it answers so many questions out of so many different areas in a singular, consistent way that actually describes a mechanical process behind it as well.
Now, in the book, do you go at all into superstring theory?
Here's the funny thing. Now, you're well-read, so you probably would know what I mean. When I say there's a problem with string theory, other than just the theoretical problems of trying to compress all these different dimensions wrapped in on themselves and give it a material expression in four-dimensional space-time, because it's still a material theory, which means all these extra dimensions have to somehow be wrapped up into space-time where we can't observe them. But all string theory, M theory, supersymmetry, standard model, all this stuff depends on one thing, the existence of a graviton. If you accept the fact that a graviton really doesn't exist, then all string theory collapses. It all goes away.
Very true. Yeah.
So that's my thought on string theory. It doesn't exist.
It's still theory. It doesn't exist. Exactly.
Yeah, it's not. It is not the theory of everything that we need.
The reason I ask is I'm always asked about if I believe in string theory, and my answer is it's just theory. You can never answer definitively on any of these theoretical hypotheses that scientists come up with, and that's the sad part. But isn't it funny how there's so much money spent on these theories that really lead nowhere in science?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, here's the thing, and there's a certain amount of validity to investigating those things. Because, again, this is what the general public isn't aware, normally, that there's a difference between theory and scientific theory. Right. Scientific theory makes predictions that are experimentally testable. And so if we had a theory about the way a sodium atom is constructed and a chlorine atom is constructed, we should be able, based on that theory, to predict that when we combine those two together, they would create a molecule that we call table salt. And then we go and do the experiment and combine the atoms together, and lo and behold, we get table salt. We've just proved that. That's a scientific theory. But a theory like there's all these kinds of universes, that's not a scientific theory. It's not testable. So we do have to pursue some of these theories and throw some money into them and see if, to test them, to see if it's true, which is what they're doing at that LHC collider, trying to find the Higgs boson.
That's true. I mean, you do have to do the work itself to see if any of the theories are real, but to what end? I mean, how much money has been spent, for example, on superstring theory, and they've still come up with, it's funny, I heard Michio Kaku once say that there's like 5 different versions of string theory out there, so they can't even get, it right to one theory.
Well, here's my explanation for that, Angel, is that I believe that the fundamental philosophy of physics, or an aspect of it, which says that every physical material effect has a physical material cause, also contained in the universe, that the universe is self-explanatory or self-determining, is a false paradigm.
Right.
That there's more to the universe than what is material and physical, or more to reality than the physical universe. And so when we get these really weird theories like string theory, they get so weird and complex and strange because they're trying to shoehorn every observation into a material explanation. And of course, Einstein said a good physical theory is something that maybe a school child should understand.
How would you classify a haunted house? Is that ghost, poltergeist? What kind of paranormal activity it consists of a haunted house?
Well, this is what I was saying earlier, that all these observations have to fit in to a particular way of looking at the universe. And we've been talking in very broad terms about my theory and how it, basically how it plays out on a cosmological scale. But it also has to be practical. It has to give us practical explanations for events that we see. So what I tell people is this. I say, okay, we have this, I'm talking about this bending of space that is associated with gravity that surrounds all these planets. And in fact, science knows that every object is surrounded by a bending of space. But what if we took that bending of space out of the vacuum of the cosmos and put it inside of a haunted house and see what it might be able to tell us about all this paranormal phenomena that people observe and measure and record? Imagine we have a bubble of space-time that opens up, the cause which is occurring non-locally. It's occurring from outside the physical universe, something above it. You can call it a higher dimension, whatever you want to envision. My book has very clear definitions and diagrams about this. But let's imagine the fabric of space-time like an old rubber inner tube used to be in all the tires. Imagine you had a weak spot in it. When you filled it up with air, a bubble would come out, like you were blowing a bubble gum bubble or something. So imagine a bubble of space-time expanding inside of a haunted house. Now, unlike the vacuum of space, a haunted house is in our atmospheric environment. There's material everywhere. It's not a vacuum. So let's say it opened up in midair inside of a haunted house, size of a baseball, something small, whatever. The first thing that would happen is that the space immediately surrounding this ball would be crushed. It's compressed and bent. This is what caused Einstein's 1.75 degree deviation of light that was traveling around the solar, disk, from this crushing and bending and twisting of space. Well, in a haunted house, that space would be occupied by air molecules. Of course, molecules composed of atoms, and in atoms we have electrons. Now, what happens when you mechanically stress electrons? Their electrons will, in the atoms, their electrons will jump into their higher orbits. They'll jump valences, and they'll raise up into higher and higher orbits. Now, if that happened with a body of atmosphere around one of these bubbles, first thing that we would measure would be the appearance and emergence of an electromagnetic field. And it would literally appear out of thin air. And, of course, we know in paranormal investigations that we see these kinds of things all the time. Now, in the world of electrons, what goes up must come down.
Right.
And so once that mechanical stress has been expended, the electrons would drop back down their lower orbits. And we know that when that happens under certain conditions, electrons can emit a couple of different things. One of the things that they can emit is photons as they're traveling back down. Photons are particles of light. We've actually built technology based on that principle. Pass an electromagnetic field through a certain physical substance, excite the electrons. When the electrons drop back down, they emit photons. That's essentially how a light-emitting diode works, an LED.
Right.
But, if it was emitting photons, those are particles of light, so that would create a luminous effect. And what I tell people, if you've been following me mentally, following the picture I'm drawing with a bubble of space-time surrounded by an electromagnetic field and emitting photons, I have just given the world its first scientific definition of what paranormal investigators call a luminous orb. And we also see these in ufology as well. They happen on a large scale. But we see these balls of radiating light.
Right.
We see situations where when they come in close proximity to electrical equipment, the electrical equipment malfunctions. Cars don't run anymore, radios go off, flashlights go dead. The same kind of thing they see in haunted houses on a smaller scale.
Right.
So here's another thing that would happen when these electrons are falling. They can also emit heat energy. Now, in recent decades, paranormal investigators have been bringing these thermal imaging cameras into these haunted sites. They've been picking up some very interesting images. Some of them are so distinct and clear that you could call them nothing else but like a thermal apparition. You could actually see the form of a human being. But because there's been no model like what I'm describing, no one has ever stopped and really studied these images to the realization that these images don't have the same kind of heat signature as a living creature, where if we take a heat image of a human being, we see the great contrasts in heat and cold between the cheeks and the tips of the ears and the nose, and the hair is much darker and the clothing is much darker. These paranormal images, Abel, have a more or less uniform heat signature across their entire surface. There's some distinction between it as far as details, but the heat signature is more or less uniform. And that means two things. Number one, that the same heat-generating mechanism is happening across the entire image. And number two, that it's happening at the surface of the image. There is no heat-generating mechanism in the core of it like there is in a living creature. So my model would explain perfectly the nature of these paranormal thermal images that are captured.
So there's nothing spirit or ghostly about them.
Well, now that's the information part. We haven't got to the information part yet. We're just talking about this mechanism, this process, which creates these kinds of emergent events and fields. Now, there's information. Remember when I said, you know, according to my model, that the entire universe is an expression of materialized information within the bends in the folds of space-time.
Right.
So if you could imagine if you had one of these balls that I described, there's been a number of paranormal investigators that have told me, Tom, you've just described what we call a spirit vortex. And then if you had information enter into it, drops below the speed of light and begins to materialize, now you have information passing in and out of this vortex. It's actually materializing inside of it. Which is why, what I say, how the entire universe is put together. Everything is that way, according to my model. But now let's go a little deeper in the rabbit hole if we can, because I'm going to leave the information aside for a second. We're going to get back to that.
Okay.
When we talk about EVPs.
That's a very interesting subject right there, because you know, some EVPs are very hard to make out, but some of them are very clear. And listening to Coast to Coast for many years, of course, Art Bell, George Norrie, all these folks love having shows on EVP, and they love playing EVPs, and a lot of them are very convincing, Tom. Some of them, even sounds of children, which is very disturbing, are captured in these EVPs. So what exactly do you believe EVPs be? Just trapped information that somebody's capturing? A loop in space and time?
Again, what I want to talk about, I'm going to get to that, very much so. But I want to talk about the environment first in which this information materializes. Because again, looking at that capstone, standing at the capstone on the pyramid, and we look at everything there from that perspective as materialized information, then it finally opens up our eyes and says, wow, you know, these disembodied voices are a collection of information, and so these are materializing information. And then everything begins to start taking shape when you stand at that capstone, so to speak. So if we go back to this expanding bubble of space-time, we've been talking about the outer edge of it.
Right.
But there's also an inside of it, too. Now, we wouldn't notice this out in the vacuum of space, in the great distances away from us, where we see all this lensing. But if it happened locally where there's atmosphere present, it would actually create a sort of a vacuum on the inside.
That's interesting.
Yeah, if you could imagine, again, like blowing up a bubble or a balloon, but that you were blowing it up with something other than air.
Right.
You know, the outer surface would push the air outward, and there would be a vacuum inside.
Right, which we all could be trapped in a big, giant bubble known as space and time. That's exactly what it is.
The universe is a giant bubble.
Exactly.
But
we're all trapped in a bubble.
Yes, we are. To the point. Parts of us are, but the information that comprises our existence is not. That's not trapped in the bubble. That's outside the bubble.
Right.
Anyway, as this bubble opened up, if it opened up very slowly, the laws of equilibrium would allow the surrounding air molecules and the heat energy that they contain to gracefully flow in and fill that vacuum. And so it would be like water seeking its own level and be very, very hardly noticeable. But if that bubble opened up very quickly, it would be very much like you waking up on a cold winter's morning, if you live in such an environment, and going to your front door and throwing it wide open. And suddenly what you get this difference in barometric pressure between the inside and the outside.
Right.
You get this cold air rushing in, or more accurately, the hot air is rushing out. And if you left all the doors and windows open, it would take a little while for the temperature to equalize between the inside of the house and the outside of the house. But until those laws of equilibrium took place, what you would have in the middle of this bubble that opened up quickly is a cold spot.
Right.
It's exactly what they detect. Now, what have I done? I've used a single simple model, and I've just taken 4 seemingly disconnected and disparate observations in a haunted house and have brought them together under one model, that they're all formed from the very same thing. There's never been anything like this before. Now, if we have a cold spot because of the vacuum in there, another thing that we would have is when air rushes in, it would create a breeze. And what do investigators report? Feeling these real quick breezes go by with no doors or windows open. Now, we go a little bit deeper in the rabbit hole, and people who witness paranormal events inside of a haunted house and investigators, very often they report at the onset of a paranormal event that they report a feeling of heaviness.
That's interesting. I've heard that
before.
Yeah,
and Angel, it's not so subjective where you'll get 10 different people that'll give you 6 different mental impressions of what they're experiencing. Right. Almost every single human being, the same word comes out of their mouth, heavy. We all know what that word heavy means.
Right.
Funny thing about it, if we had an expanding bubble of space-time, those bends of that bubble would create their own additional gravitational field.
Right.
And so when somebody says this room feels heavy, they're right. It's literally true. It's all...
Now,
go ahead.
Real quick. Now, we're all in a bubble. The theory of the multiverse, going back to that real quick, is that there is a bubble, and outside the bubble there are many other bubbles. Could that still be a possibility then, that maybe there are other bubbles outside of our bubble?
You're talking about the Bream model of the multiverse.
Right.
They like a big giant jar of marbles, and that you have all these different marble universes adjacent to one another. But when you stop and think about it, how many marbles could fit around a single marble?
Well, we're talking about a much larger space and time than we can possibly think of right now by looking even at outer space. I mean, we're talking about something much, much larger.
Sure, but according to that Bream model, that would mean our universe is one of the marbles.
Right.
And then there's other marbles that are adjacent to ours, but there would be only so many universes that could be against our marble, physically. There would only be, 6, 8 that would be able to actually touch our, surround our universe. And we have every reason to believe, based on the scientific speculation, that none of those universes adjacent would resemble ours in any way, shape, or form. This is where people get this multiverse idea and they don't think it out.
Right.
And science likes to promote the multiverse out to the masses because it's another way for them to destroy anything spiritual or having to do with God or a creator. They blame it on these other groups of material called the multiverse. They know how silly it is. Give you an example. I'll give you just one example because this is important to figure out. The concept of the multiverse is that every quantum probability realizes in a separate universe. All right? Now, let's take a look at a penny. A penny has probably millions of quantum states inside of it. And so every one of those quantum states realizes in a different way and spawns off its own universe. Now, multiply the volume of that penny out to the size of the universe itself, And think about all the quantum states and all the quantum probabilities. Now, the smallest unit of quantum state, in other words, the smallest unit of time where a quantum state doesn't change, is 12 attoseconds. We measured that a few years back. An attosecond is a billionth of a second.
Right.
All right? So think of all the quantum states in the universe spawning off all these different probabilities every 12 attoseconds for 14 billion years. Now, what makes anybody think that any adjacent universe would have any resemblance to ours at all?
That's very true. That makes a lot of sense. It's still a very nice theory to think that there could be multiple universes just slightly different from ours. Makes for great TV and great movies, doesn't it, though?
It really does. And this is this egocentric kind of thing.
Right.
When people look at this kind of a way, when they look at the multiverse, all they think about is all the different choices that we human beings could make. Well, the Earth has been around or the universe has been around for billions of years before man existed. Why do you think that multiverses are spawned only by human choices? That's absolutely asinine.
That's the human ego. We're always the center of everything. We were the center of the universe for a long, long time.
When you put the ego aside and start looking at the physics itself, the multiverse starts looking very, very silly. Now, here's the body of evidence why I say that the multiverse can't be. Because people have tried to blame this or use this as a explanation for paranormal phenomena. But the kind of observations that they see in haunted houses are precisely, exactly the same kind of information that we have in our local universe. We see apparitions of human beings exactly like we are. We hear voices, not only in an audible tone, not like static nonsense. Right. We don't only hear an audible language, but we hear it in an audible terrestrial language.
We get answers.
Information that all the information we're getting is identical to our own universe.
Right.
So how could it be coming from another universe? Because that universe, by science, would be different than ours.
Right, but now, let's move that aside and say, okay, if there are parallel universes, they're not identical to ours. This noise, then, this would be coming from a dimension where? Heaven? Is that, another dimension that we don't know about? Is that what heaven is, another dimension? If
we were going to talk about David Bohm's holographic universe and his implicate order, all the information in our universe, our physical universe, exists in a layer right above the physical. Okay. It's the same information. It's part of our universe, or part of our reality. The only difference is that it materializes in four-dimensional space-time. Therefore, there's no need for all these multiple universes. There's only a need for a superphysical overlay on ours. And that explains everything better than all of these other explanations do. Plato called it forms. The Bible in the New Testament, first paragraph of John, uses the Greek word logos. It's the exact same idea, form, structure, matrix, thought. Edgar Casey called it akasha. He said this is how he could get a diagnosis on somebody 1,000 miles away, because he was pulling the information down from where it originated above space-time.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it starts bringing in parapsychology and all those things together under one physical roof, so to speak. Now, here we have a bubble of space-time in a haunted house. And let's say we have vocal information. We're talking about disembodied voices.
Right.
All right, now we're going to go and talk about the spirit a little bit. Let's say there is a deceased person that still has an intelligence, a coherent collection of information, but no materialized body in our physical realm. And it tries to speak. And that vocalized information enters into one of these bubbles of space-time and begins to materialize as soon as it falls subliminal, below the speed of light. Well, the outside of that bubble will begin to conform to that information. Like when we see an apparition of somebody that lived 150 years ago. It's their exact same information that comprised their being 150 years ago, dropping down into this bubble and materializing in front of us, and the bubble immediately takes the geometric shape of that information. And it creates a surface that reflects photons, which is why we can see it, and record it on cameras, because it's reflecting photons at us. Just like every object, without reflected photons, we can't see a thing. We're absolutely blind.
Right.
So now imagine this vocalized information coming down this bubble, materializing and shaping the surface of this bubble, so that the surface begins to vibrate to the frequency and amplitude of a vocalization. What would happen is that the very surface of space, Angel, would begin to act like a speaker, like the paper in a loudspeaker. And we would literally hear a disembodied voice coming out of midair, because the very surface of space-time is acting like a set of vocal cords.
That's interesting. When you read the Bible, it does say God spoke, and then there was life.
Oh, yeah. The Word, He spoke the Logos.
Right.
He said light.
He spoke life into existence. That's that's always been a theory of mine. That everything is on a wave, so to speak, and we're all riding the wave. Art Bell a long time ago would say that the veil is dropping. And do you think that the fact that we're seeing more and more paranormal activity, that there is some kind of a veil dropping, per se, as Art Bell would put it back in the day?
It's hard to say on that. We're certainly becoming more aware of it, and we're thinking about it more often and recognizing it more of a reality. That we're observing it more could just be the fact of publicity. More people are talking freely about it. There are more human beings in more houses than there were 20 or 30 years ago. But the vibration is very interesting, because part of my theory is a pre-creational substance called diffluence. That it's actually a wave function that has actually, it's recently been demonstrated that a mathematical wave function actually does have an abject reality.
Right.
And this creates a substance that's shaped by this information, the flow of which bends into our space-time and materializes into physical reality. God created the world, and it was void and formless. Another place in the Bible, it says the universe was made out of formless matter. This immaterial substance, this pre-physical substance, that God spoke the order, the information, light, and it materialized into physical reality.
Right.
So this theory ties together the anomalies of physics, it ties together paranormal phenomena, and it ties together biblical principle and parapsychology in the one model. Never been done before. This is something so very new.
Now, aliens easily fit into your theory also, and I'm sure you believe in extraterrestrial existence, right?
I say, this is what I say. I say that it is virtually impossible for life to not exist elsewhere. The universe, to me, is alive.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, anywhere certain conditions are present, the universe will bring forth life. And I use a scientific definition of systems in order to explain this. One of the things you have to be wary with about physics is that they'll apply their rules in the certain areas they want to, but they won't venture into other areas with those same rules. Like, for example, they won't venture into psychology. Whereas I say to a physicist, hey, wait a minute. The human brain is something physical. Isn't that physics? Oh, no, we don't go there. Oh, no. They don't want to go there, but I do grab physicists kicking and screaming into places they don't want to go.
Right.
So the human brain is a subset of the physical universe. Think about a deck of cards. Think about the deck of cards as a system. 52 cards.
Okay.
15 face values, 4 suits. You could come up with a myriad number of complex variations in hands that you could deal. Certainly a myriad of card rules, game rules, all kinds. In the end, every game that you could possibly conceive and every hand that you could possibly deal will never be outside of the rules that govern the greater system.
Right.
You can't come up with a game rule or a hand that works contrary to or outside of the laws and principles that govern the greater system. Well, we have a set of laws and principles. We don't fully understand them. We're still discovering them. But we have a set of laws and principles that govern the greater universe. That's a system. The human brain is a subset of that system. Therefore, there's nothing in the human brain that could operate in a way that's contrary to or outside of the laws and principles that govern the greater system in which it is a subset. So, if we are alive, that means the universe is alive. The only other alternative is that the universe gave rise to a subset which operates in contradiction or outside of its greater principles.
Right.
The universe has to rise to life.
Right.
That
would make perfect sense. But what does this leave the theory of God then? I mean, is there a God controlling everything? Is there a single being controlling everything, or is it all just always been here? This is just the way it is.
Well, now we get back, Angel, to what we were talking about earlier with physics. Are we going to accept, are we going to continue to labor under the false paradigm that every physical effect in the universe has a physical material cause, or will we accept the fact that the universe is more than the sum total of its physical parts? Once we consider that question, and we also accept the fact that the universe itself must be intelligent because it gave rise to intelligence, i.e. the brain. Now we have a fundamental question. Did the universe establish its own intelligence? Or did an outside intelligence build the universe in its image? That would be God. Only question. Yeah, that's the only question.
Yep.
You know, when it comes down to it, when you're standing at that capstone and all these things become apparent, that's the only remaining question. You know, are you going to believe that the universe created everything itself?
That would be the final question. Who created the universe?
That's it. You know, and once the age of denial.
But then you have to get back into then the question: who created God? If there is a God that created the universe.
Well, that comes into a different set of philosophical issues. We can't even phrase the term correctly. If God is infinite, that means God would exist outside of everything that we would consider to be physical, universe, time and space. So you say, what created God? Okay? Well, the term what is a designation of a thing. We have to throw that word out. Outside of space and time, there is no thing. There's nothing, no thing. We use the word created. That has past tense. It has a temporal designation. There is no time in infinity. So we have to throw that word out too. So we find when we ask these questions like, what a thing was temporal God doing, present tense, before, past tense, he created, past tense, the heaven and earth, things. The only word that we can't throw out is God. Everything else we have to come to the realization that our physical brains and lips don't even have the intellectual integrity to verbalize the question correctly.
That's very interesting. Kind of puts a whole new perspective on what God is, doesn't it? Just a little bit.
That's why God told Moses when he said, Who am I going to tell you sent me? He says, I am that I am. That's the best I could tell, you stupid mortal flesh and blood. So tell him I am sent you. You know, at least that gives some sense of my infinity. But I wanted to just drop something else in because we were talking about the voices.
Right.
And I just wanted to mention, because EVPs are such a big subject today, we were talking about that surface of that bubble.
Right.
Beginning to vibrate with a frequency and amplitude according to the vocalized information materializing in it. Well, if you remember a while back, I was talking about these bubbles being jacketed in the presence of matter, like in atmosphere in a haunted house. It's jacketed in an electromagnetic field. Well, as that bubble conforms, it sets off an electromagnetic compression according to the frequency and the amplitude of the materialized information. It travels into the vicinity of a recorder. It bypasses the microphone's acoustic diaphragm because it's not an acoustic wave, it's an electromagnetic compression, and induces itself directly on the copper coils that are connected to the diaphragm. Now, when those coils move back and forth in a magnet, they created a field that's interpreted in the recorder as a voice, as a sound. Well, here, the actual electromagnetic field is inducing itself onto the coils. It gets converted into the device as an audible voice, and so this is why people can be standing all around a recorder, and they get an EVP that's only heard on the recorder, but not by the ear, because it's an electromagnetic wave. It's not an audible wave. And so one other paranormal phenomenon gets brought into this under the same umbrella.
That's simply mind-boggling how you could put so many different paranormal phenomena under one theory. It truly is a theory of everything. Thomas, we have to have you back on the show. We're almost out of time here, sadly enough, but we have to have you back on so we can do another couple hours on the book. But I want you to tell everybody listening in, exactly how they can get the book, your website, give them all the info, and please promote it. And everybody, I urge to get a copy of this book. In fact, I want to get a copy of this book. I want to read it, and I want to have you back on once I read the actual book so we can talk about it a little bit more. Tell everybody how we can get the book, please.
Yeah, and we really need to, because we didn't get into the UFO phenomenon, and I really wanted to, because in my book what I say is that the things that we see naturally occurring in haunted houses, if someone understood the science behind it, they could build technology based on it, and that's exactly how UFOs behave. So the book talks about that. You can find about the book and my appearances in other shows, my blog, related articles, where to buy the book. Everything can be found at www.cosmicveil, V-E-I-L, cosmicveil.com.
Thank you so much, sir, and have a great night.
You do the same.
Take care, Thomas.